December 31st, 2006. The British Treasury wired $83 million to the United States government, closing the final installment on a debt that had begun in 1946. Britain had finished paying for World War II more than 60 years after victory, after 3 generations of taxpayers had kept the account alive. The popular story treats that loan as a tidy footnote, a technical detail of post-war reconstruction. But the uncomfortable truth hiding behind the payment is that the debt was not the price of winning the war. It was the price America charged Britain for permission to remain in the war at all. And the interest payments were only the most visible, least important layer of what was taken. If you're into money and investing, subscribe and support this video with a like. Now, let's continue. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States oversaw what can be described as the largest peaceful transfer of wealth in human history. Not through invasion, but through contracts, forced sales, and leverage applied during crisis. Britain entered the war as the world's greatest creditor nation, commanding a quarter of the planet through the British Empire and sitting at the center of global finance. Britain emerged exhausted and bankrupt, its gold drained away, its investments liquidated in distress sales, its strategic bases leased out for 99 years, and its government saddled with roughly $31 billion owed to Washington, a figure that translates to hundreds of billions in today's money. Yet the deeper cost was not a number on a balance sheet. The deeper cost was that the empire itself ceased to be economically viable, and the pound ceased to be the unquestioned anchor of world trade. This was not an act of charity wrapped in friendly rhetoric, and it was not a simple alliance of equals doing what partners do. It functioned like the largest asset-stripping operation ever executed, disguised as aid, and carried out with deliberate financial precision, while Britain fought for survival against Nazi Germany. To see the mechanism clearly, you have to look beyond slogans like Lend-Lease and focus on what Britain was forced to sell, who benefited from the liquidation, why American assistance was cut off 7 days after Japan surrendered, and how the 1946 loan terms crushed what remained of British economic autonomy. Understanding that chain is not merely an argument about World War II memory. It is a way to see how the United States built and maintained empire through debt, forced liquidation, and extracting concessions from allies at their weakest moment, because the same basic playbook appears again and again. On December 8, 1940, Winston Churchill wrote the most consequential letter of his career to Franklin Roosevelt. The opening described a strategic reality that was turning desperate. German U-boats were sinking merchant shipping in the Atlantic. The Luftwaffe was hammering British cities, and Britain needed everything: ammunition, aircraft, tanks, fuel, raw materials, and replacement equipment. Then Churchill delivered the admission that mattered most in Washington. Britain was not merely strained or running low. Britain was broke, completely bankrupt, and the Treasury could no longer pay cash for American supplies. In classrooms, that letter is usually treated as a dramatic plea between friends, a prime minister asking a sympathetic president for help against Hitler. But if you read the letter through a financial lens, it looks less like a plea for rescue and more like a negotiation over liquidation terms. Before September 1939, Britain was still the wealthiest nation on earth in the sense that matters to power, global assets, global income streams, and global control of finance. The British Empire encompassed roughly 5 million square kilometers, about 24% of the world's land surface, and British citizens held vast overseas investments that modern comparisons place in the hundreds of billions of dollars. British companies owned railways in Argentina, copper mines in Chile, rubber plantations in Malaya, and oil interests in Persia. London remained the planet's premier financial marketplace. Sterling functioned as the global reserve currency, and Britain held roughly $6 billion in gold reserves, second only to the United States. Yet by the end of 1940, that cushion had vanished. The key reason was not battlefield defeat, but the financial structure America used while it remained officially neutral. The United States in 1939 still had an isolationist public, and Congress had passed neutrality acts designed to keep America out of European war. Those acts contained a clause that would become a financial vice on Britain: cash and carry. Belligerent nations could buy American weapons and supplies, but only if they paid cash up front and transported the goods on their own ships. no loans, no credit, and no deferred payment, because gold or dollars had to be on the barrelhead before anything left American docks. Britain had no practical alternative. The war demanded American steel, oil, aircraft, industrial machinery, and munitions, and the industrial centers of the United States were the only source capable of meeting demand at scale. So, Britain paid, and it paid the only way America would accept. In June 1940, Operation Fish began, a vast emergency shipment in which Britain loaded much of its gold reserves and financial securities onto battleships and ocean liners and sent them across a U-boat-infested Atlantic into vaults in Canada and the United States. It became one of the largest movements of physical wealth ever attempted, because it amounted to Britain sending national treasure into exile to keep buying from America. By November 1940, the gold was essentially gone. Britain was still ordering aircraft and tanks, still signing contracts, still trying to hold off German pressure, but the British Purchasing Commission in Washington received the message from London that mattered. There were no dollars left. This is where the myth of Lend-Lease begins, a myth that tends to flatten the negotiation into a simple act of generosity. In the popular telling, Roosevelt wanted to help but faced domestic political constraints, so he created a program that would lend equipment to Britain and allow repayment later. He sold it with a warm analogy about a neighbor's house on fire and a borrowed garden hose, implying that you help first and settle accounts later. It is an elegant story, but it is not how the machinery worked. The actual terms were negotiated behind closed doors between the U.S. Treasury and British officials who had almost no leverage left. The leading American figure in those talks was Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, Jr., Roosevelt's closest financial advisor, and he was not motivated by sentimentality. Morgenthau approached the crisis like a creditor, approaching a distressed borrower. Before Congress even passed Lend-Lease, he demanded a complete audit of British wealth, including assets owned by the British government and assets owned by private British citizens across the world. That demand carried a brutal implication. While London was being bombed and the Atlantic lifeline was being attacked, America's condition for continued supplies was that Britain open its financial records to a foreign power and prove it was truly destitute. The British negotiating team, led by Sir Frederick Phillips, argued that Britain had already shipped out its gold and that forcing the liquidation of long-term investments during wartime would trigger fire sale prices. Phillips warned that selling income-producing assets would leave Britain hollowed out after the war, because those investments were what generated the overseas earnings that supported Britain's standard of living. Morgenthau did not bend. His argument was blunt. If Britain still had assets in America, then American taxpayers should not be subsidizing Britain's war. Liquidate everything first, then aid could begin. That position also served a political purpose at home. In early 1941, Congress was debating Lend-Lease amid fierce isolationist skepticism, and critics argued that Britain was secretly rich and trying to trick Americans into paying its bills. Morgenthau needed proof of Britain's financial ruin, and he needed a visible sacrifice that would demonstrate Britain had nothing left to offer except liquidation. He found that sacrifice in American Viscose, a major American manufacturer of rayon and artificial silk that was owned by Cutoff, a British company. American Viscose was valued at over $100 million and generated dividends that flowed back to London, making it precisely the kind of asset Morgenthau wanted turned into cash. He told British negotiators they must sell it immediately, deposit the proceeds in the U.S. Treasury, and use the dollars to pay existing weapons orders. The British resisted because selling under duress would produce a devastating price, but Morgenthau delivered an ultimatum that stripped away the illusion of partnership. Sell American Viscose or Lend-Lease would die in Congress. On March 15, 1941, Britain used emergency war powers to seize the company from its owners and force a sale, a compulsory purchase carried out because Britain had no other choice. The sale was handled by American investment bankers who understood Britain's desperation and negotiated accordingly. American Viscose sold for $54.4 million, roughly half its value, and the structure of the deal added further humiliation. The British government compensated Courtaulds in pounds in London, increasing internal British debt, while the dollars from the sale were transferred directly to the U.S. Treasury. That was not an exchange between friends. It functioned like foreclosure because America was liquidating a distressed ally's assets at fire sale prices, while the ally was fighting for survival. American Viscose was not an isolated case. Morgenthau pushed Britain to sell hundreds of millions of dollars in American securities, stocks, and holdings owned by British citizens and institutions, forcing liquidation across industries and wiping out investment portfolios built over generations. By mid-1941, Britain had liquidated around $1.1 billion American investments, a figure often translated to tens of billions in today's money. The U.S. Treasury tracked the sales, verified the proceeds, and withheld the flow of aid until liquidation targets were met. The message was consistent. First the empire sells, then America supplies. The extraction went beyond financial portfolios and moved into strategic geography. In September 1940, before Lend-Lease even existed as law, Britain struck the destroyers for bases deal because German submarines were threatening Britain's Atlantic survival. Roosevelt agreed to provide 50 old destroyers, mostly obsolete World War I-era ships that had been sitting in mothballs and were hardly a prize. In exchange, Britain granted the United States 99-year leases on a network of military bases stretching from Newfoundland through the Caribbean, including locations such as Bermuda, the Bahamas, Jamaica, Trinidad, and other points that allowed control of critical sea lanes. In practical terms, Britain traded long-term strategic control of the North Atlantic and Caribbean for a handful of aging ships, and those bases became a foundation of American hemispheric power. It was the geopolitical equivalent of pawning your estate for short-term cash, because Britain was trading future influence for the chance to keep breathing. Lend-Lease passed on March 11, 1941, and eventually grew into a massive program across the Allied world. For Britain, it delivered roughly $31 billion in assistance over the war years, and the propaganda framed the policy as America acting as an arsenal of democracy. It is also true that without American supplies, Britain could have been starved into submission because the island's war economy depended on imported food and materials, and on maintaining shipping lanes under constant attack. But the program was not a gift in the way the public story suggests. It was a lease backed by legal clauses that extracted future concessions, and even the name hinted at a reckoning to come. The most consequential clause was embedded in Article 7 of the Lend-Lease Agreement. On the surface, it demanded that after the war, Britain eliminate discriminatory treatment in international commerce, a phrase that sounds like a generic commitment to free trade. In reality, discriminatory treatment was code for imperial preference, the tariff system that held the British Empire together economically by giving British goods favorable access in imperial markets. Imperial preference was not a small policy detail. It was the wall that protected British industry from American competition in places like Canada, Australia, India, and South Africa, where tariffs made British products cheaper than foreign goods. American cars and machinery were often superior, but the tariff structure allowed British manufacturers to sell anyway. Article 7 required Britain to dismantle that wall after the war, opening imperial markets to American corporations on equal terms and eroding the economic glue of the empire itself. British negotiators understood the implication immediately because it amounted to signing away the economic logic that kept the empire functioning as a unit. But Britain signed because Britain was under bombardment, shipping was under attack, and the alternative to signing was losing the war. The country fought with American equipment funded by Britain selling its assets and promising to dismantle its post-war protection. As the conflict dragged through 1942, 1943, and 1944, the wealth transfer widened into commercial dominance. American industry surged, and U.S. GDP rose dramatically during the war years as factories produced weapons not only for America, but for the Allied system. Britain, meanwhile, converted almost its entire industrial base to war production, which meant it largely stopped exporting civilian goods and abandoned many overseas markets. Those abandoned markets did not remain empty. American companies moved in, supplying consumer goods and machinery to Latin America, Asia, and Africa, while British factories focused on aircraft and weapons. America was not only fighting a war, it was capturing Britain's commercial future, while Britain bled. By 1944, the shift was visible everywhere. Global gold reserves had moved decisively toward U.S. vaults. The center of financial gravity shifted across the Atlantic, and the dollar increasingly replaced sterling as the core reserve currency. Britain still believed its sacrifices would be honored after victory, because it had fought alone for years and had emptied itself to defeat Hitler. That belief did not survive contact with American policy. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered, and crowds in London celebrated the end of war. 7 days later, on August 21, 1945, President Harry Truman signed an executive order terminating Lend-Lease immediately. There was no transition period and no phased drawdown designed to keep Britain stable during Reconstruction. American supply ships already in the Atlantic were ordered to turn around and return to the United States, cutting the lifeline as abruptly as if it had never existed. British officials were stunned because they had assumed that aid would continue long enough to retool their economy from war to peace. That conversion required time, and Britain's economy had been distorted around military needs for years. The country imported a large share of its food and nearly all critical raw materials, and those imports had been financed with Lend-Lease dollars. Without them, Britain faced the threat of starvation and default. John Maynard Keynes, Britain's most formidable economist, calculated that the country was approaching a financial Dunkirk, a collapse that could force Britain to stop importing food and impose rationing so severe it risked real hunger. The conclusion was brutal. Britain had to beg for another loan. In September 1945, Keynes traveled to Washington while seriously ill with heart disease, not as a triumphant intellectual, but as a supplicant trying to prevent national economic collapse. Keynes believed Britain had earned a grant, not a loan, because Britain had fought alone for years, while America remained neutral, and because Britain had sacrificed its economy for the broader defeat of fascism. He asked for a grant of roughly $6 billion, UAS framing it as justice and retroactive payment for the sacrifice. In Washington, the moral argument failed. The American negotiators, led by Fred Vinson, did not treat justice as a bargaining chip. The war was over, Congress was wary of continued European commitments, and the American public was exhausted by war spending. The offer came back as a loan, about $3.75 billion at 2% interest, barely enough to keep Britain afloat. Worse, the loan came with conditions designed to break what remained of Britain's economic independence, and the most damaging condition was sterling convertibility. The United States demanded that within a year, Britain must make the pound fully convertible, meaning anyone holding pounds could exchange them for U.S. dollars. The policy was presented as free trade, but Keynes recognized it as a trap. During the war, Britain had forced many colonies and partners to accept payment in pounds, while restricting their ability to convert those pounds into dollars, creating a controlled sterling area. Countries such as India, Australia, and Egypt accumulated sterling balances but were effectively compelled to spend them on British goods, which protected British industry and preserved scarce dollars. If sterling became convertible, those holders could immediately cash out into dollars to buy American goods that were widely seen as superior and in demand. Keynes warned that opening convertibility would trigger a run on the pound, draining Britain's dollar reserves at the worst possible moment. He fought against the condition as his health collapsed, but the alternative to accepting was economic breakdown and hunger. Britain signed. The Anglo-American Loan Agreement was finalized in 1946, and Keynes died in April of that year, his heart failing after months of stress spent trying to salvage Britain's future. Britain then faced one of the harshest winters in its history in early 1947. When blizzards buried the country, coal froze, power stations shut down, and the public suffered through cold homes and disrupted industry. In that weakened moment, the loan conditions came due. On July 15, 1947, Britain made sterling convertible as required. The consequences were immediate and brutal. Sterling holders rushed to sell pounds for dollars, and Britain hemorrhaged reserves at a pace the government could not sustain. Within a month, hundreds of millions of dollars were gone, and within 5 weeks Britain suspended convertibility, having burned through roughly a quarter of the loan for no productive gain. That financial humiliation had geopolitical consequences that arrived almost instantly. In February 1947, Britain informed the U.S. State Department that it could no longer afford to sustain its long-standing role as guardian of Greece and Turkey against Soviet pressure, essentially telling Washington that if it wanted to block communist influence, it would have to do the job itself. That message helped catalyze the Truman Doctrine and marked a formal transfer of strategic responsibility from Britain to the United States. Britain's imperial posture was collapsing not because it had been conquered, but because it could no longer finance its commitments. In 1949, with the economy still weak, Britain devalued sterling sharply, and overnight the country became dramatically poorer relative to the dollar world. Even after humiliation, the debt itself remained a commercial obligation. The 1946 loan was not forgiven, and it carried annual interest, so every year for decades the British Treasury sent payments to the U.S. Treasury. Through the post-war boom, through inflation, through political revolutions at home, the payments continued. They finally ended in late 2006, a reminder that the war's financial settlement outlasted the war by generations. So, who benefited from the extraction described in this story? Morgenthau orchestrated the liquidation and remained influential without facing consequences for squeezing an ally during its darkest hour. American investment banks and brokers that handled forced sales earned substantial fees, and major financial institutions facilitated the process while Britain's bargaining position was non-existent. American corporations that bought British-owned assets in distress deals gained immediate upside, because a company sold at half value can become an instant windfall to the buyer. The American military-industrial firms that produced Lend-Lease equipment were paid by the U.S. government, which meant the program functioned as a gigantic subsidy to American industry, while Britain's economy was hollowed out, paying to stay alive. At the macro level, the United States emerged holding a dominant share of global gold reserves, with the dollar replacing sterling as the global reserve currency, and with a network of long-term military bases that allowed power projection across oceans. In this telling, the British Empire was not militarily conquered. It was purchased in a distressed sale managed by contracts and leverage, with America acquiring assets, bases, markets, and geopolitical influence as Britain paid for survival. The argument does not stop with Britain, because it frames this as a repeating pattern applied to American allies after 1945. Germany was rebuilt under the Marshall Plan, but the aid came with conditions that required open markets, American bases, and alignment with Washington's strategic priorities. Japan was occupied and reorganized, rebuilt with American support, and became structurally dependent, with U.S. bases remaining and large holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds binding its financial future to American stability. South Korea followed a similar arc after the Korean War, with protection and prosperity paired with continued strategic dependence. The pattern, as presented, repeats: crisis creates dependence. Dependence creates concessions. Concessions transfer wealth and sovereignty toward the United States. The conventional mythology of World War II teaches that America saved Britain, and it celebrates the special relationship as an alliance of equals. The darker interpretation insists the documents and numbers tell a different story. Britain gave up everything, and America took everything it could, while Britain was too desperate to refuse. In December 1940, Churchill asked Roosevelt for help, and in doing so, he effectively signed away Britain's future autonomy in exchange for the ability to keep fighting. It was a deal made under existential threat, with no painless alternative, but the cost was the empire. Britain defeated Hitler and won the war in the military sense, but it lost the empire in the financial and strategic sense, and it paid its closest ally for the privilege of surviving. In this framework, Lend-Lease was not the pure arsenal of democracy. It was the most efficient asset-stripping operation of the 20th century, executed through law and finance while bombs fell and shipping sank. And if that changes the way you see alliances, it also changes the way you see modern power, because the playbook does not require conquest when debt and crisis can achieve the same result.